Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Kelly Goolsby. He's director of solution architecture at Nexcess. Welcome, Kelly.
Hey, John, thanks for having me today. Appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, we've had you on before. I love
Yeah,
repeats because we can dive a little deeper. But for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and Nexus.
yeah. So again, Kelly Goolsby, I have worked in the IT and specifically managed hosting industry. And I think if you don't know managed hosting, we're basically everything you need in a data center, but including providing servers, software, most software you need. We're responsible for sort of securing those data centers and providing access, and we'll talk more about that. But providing it as a simple monthly service that customers can contract for whatever reason. I've been doing this for almost 2.5 decades now.
Wow.
And about yeah, I feel a little old, but in the last 8 years, in specific at Nexcess, and I'll mention a little what who Nexcess is, but I've been doing it. And then specific to the healthcare space, we deal with a lot of customers, but our two of our larger segments both have similar compliance needs, right? Payment card industry and healthcare. And people ask me, how are they different? They are, but in a lot of things they're the same, right? Protect data, protect access, and help your customers where you can to make sure things are secure. But what I and my team do is sort of design solutions based on client requirements in these business areas, and try to match our products and services and where we can. And then if our products and services don't match the customer need, we can refer and say, we don't do this, but here's somebody that we know does this or that we vetted sometimes. So I think the biggest part of our job is solution architecture is know when to say no, or yes, but right. You could do it that way, but here's the way we've seen be successful, and that's what we try to do is bring experience from talking to lots of customers across all segments, but in particular healthcare IT.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's leveraged hosting architecture like yours the last 2 decades myself, I'm
Mhm.
familiar with it. I've even seen the evolution from Liquid Web to Nexus and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
the iterations in between. So it's great to have you on to talk about what's happening with Nexus and everything you're doing there. When a new system gets introduced, like what process should organizations have in place to make sure that they bring themselves into this new system into the compliance
Mhm.
posture that's important to them, and why is a compliance audit maybe not enough to cover an
Yeah.
organization?
Absolutely. And I guess I'll mention too first, you hinted at it, John, but Nexus may be a new name to some people that saw me before, about a year and a half ago, whenever that was, or to people that have looked at us. And I don't get too caught up in a name, but for years, this company was called Liquid Web. A lot of people know that name. I'm not wearing a Liquid Web shirt today. That's happened. But Nexus has been a well trusted brand that we've owned for a long time. We started looking at company names, we went to the markets, and who should we be? And Nexus was there. And I think it's a name that says we're kind of at the nexus of customer requirements and technology and trying to help a consultative way for our clients. And so Nexus is the new name, but it's really an old name and something we've had for a while. So just want to make sure if anybody listened to this before knows us. Nexus Liquid Web, we did some magic in domain DNS resolution. They'll both get you to us, which is the important thing, so you can talk to us. But yeah, you I think you mentioned that why isn't audit not enough? And in particular, you kind of you kind of gave my answer away, but that's fine because you asked about it from a new system standpoint. And I think no business, whether it's healthcare or any other segment, wants to be static, right? Whether obviously providers want to help patients first of all. To do that, they have to add new applications, new functionality. We know how much that's changed since COVID in the era of telehealth. And rarely does a practice, a hospital, whatever it is, or even a Medicare SaaS have a single application or functionality. And so I always think about point in time, right? Audits are great. You certainly don't want to go through an audit every month, right? This cycle is typically yearly. But a lot of stuff happens between January and January or February and February in an audit period. And audits are sort of a look back, right? What have we done? What are these controls that we set some time ago? And then how have we done against them, right? You're demonstrating things. What it doesn't do is talk about the future and change management. And so, I think about that and I talk to providers all the time who are adding a new functionality or just changing a data flow in their application, something that didn't need PHI 3 months ago, all of a sudden needs to access PHI. And so yes, you can wait for the audit, but it's too late often then, right? So establishing like one and is establishing data mapping so you know where PHI lives, where it sits, and then when you have a new application, you're going to refer to that process, right? You're going to say, yeah, I'm going to wait for an audit, but I'm going to make sure this is correct now so that when I have an audit, I'm not just hustling to demonstrate, right? So that's why an audit's not enough. It's sort of an ongoing process that accounts for what's going to happen in the audit. And then it's typically not as much of a surprise, right? We know we've added this application. It's got the proper security controls set up, the proper encryption. It lives somewhere in the network we've documented. We know it's going to be recoverable in 72 hours from an attack that has the proper antivirus. So you definitely should wait for an audit. So we don't audit. That's the other thing. Your provider, at least in our space, infrastructure as a service, I would not want us to have an audit function because I think that has to be separate from the provider. So we are experts in securing a data center, access controls, incident management inside our data center. But we're not auditors, and everyone should consult, a certified auditor. Lots of different ways to do that, and great companies out there. And you probably talked to some of them, but that's definitely what we want people to do, and then come back to us with audit findings and preparation.
Yeah. Well, and even more than the audit is ensuring that any new applications aren't going to suffer a breach, which is even worse than having it
Yeah,
turn up in the audit. So I think that's a
yeah, and
powerful thing.
it is, sorry. And I don't know if, in central IT, maybe not as much in healthcare, but I think it exists, is shadow IT, right?
Mm. Ah,
I was at a security conference recently, and I heard an interesting statement where it was said, if you don't provide the applications your staff and teams need and make sure they're secure, they're going to go get them, right? They're
yeah.
going to go, whether it's to help serve a patient, solve a problem. Eventually they get tired of asking, and the larger the organization, the more likely it is that someone says, hey, we need this, I need to file transfer, because patients, customers are asking for it. And so something gets added, and if it stays outside a normal IT process, you may not know until there's a breach.
Yeah,
I've had that happen a
absolutely.
number of times. Yeah,
Yeah, well, and AI has made it so easy for anyone to implement it. So that's
absolutely,
happening so often.
absolutely.
How common is it for you, as you work with different organization, that there's maybe a gap in a hosting provider claiming to be HIPAA configured, or
Mm,
but maybe there's no BAA on file, or the
yeah.
backups are failing, or or maybe they're only partially covering new file stores, or like what do you see in
Yeah.
the industry there, and how does that align with kind of the regulatory requirements? HIPAA being one, but certainly other ones as far as speed of restoration or other
Mhm.
things. Like, what are you seeing out there as far as the gap in what's required compliance and what people say they do, but they
Mhm.
don't actually?
Yeah, I should mention not everybody's doing it badly, and maybe I have a selection bias because people come to us for help. And I mentioned this in some conversations recently. We're often the second choice that people make after leaving their data center or leaving a shared hoster or a total SaaS model where they have something, and so they make a move, and nobody's going to say, "Hey, we say we're here compliant, but we're no good," and so it's very common just to say, "Hey, checkbox, they have HIPAA compliance, they will sign a BA." And to your point, um, maybe they promised a BA and never sent it, but what we're seeing is one, the BAA is not enough, right? A BAA is sort of a framework that you should be asking a provider questions, right? You have a BAA, but that doesn't, it separates and does some shared responsibility in there, but it doesn't say that the things you say you do, you can actually do. And so, yeah, it's a big gap. And so I often find people that if the provider still signs a BA, it's still valid. They might have even gone through a SOC audit and a high tech audit. But one, you have to be able to produce that on a yearly cycle. And we all have to understand, again, audits are retrospective. So you're going to get that audit, but you should get it in a timely manner. And you should be able to ask questions about that audit, right? You've established this control and said you do, network DDoS protection, or you do, high level cybersecurity, or you've sold me solutions, point solutions, antivirus, malware protection. I need to see the logs of those, and that's you know, I'm not from Missouri, but it's a show me state, and I've heard people say that a lot. That you need to show me, right? Just saying it is not enough, and If you were in my business as a provider for a long time, you could just do that. But I think we're seeing a lot more enforcement against providers. In fact, I think 2025, don't quote me, I'd have to look it up, but one of them was a record year in how much the OCR had actually fined providers who were not holding to their commitments for HIPAA and high tech. And that's kind of new, right? Before it was providers took the brunt of that. Sorry, the actual healthcare provider, not a processor. But we're seeing more. I use provider in two ways there. Hosting providers, data center providers are actually being held accountable in enforcement. So that's new, and I hope that's great. Actually, I think it puts a little more skin in the game and should weed out. I don't think it's ever going to be just Nexcess, but I would like to be in a peer group who's all intent on doing the right thing for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The BAAs are being held more accountable. But I think when an auditor shows up, the question for me is always that word defensible. Like what does
Hmm.
defensible mean to you in practice? And what should orgs be asking their hosting partners to make sure that if they do get audited,
Hmm.
they're in a defensible position?
Yeah. Yeah. So, it could be a lot of things. It could be just a test, restore, and backup because of the 72-hour rule. It's great to say we're taking backups. And then you see a report, right? I think every provider out there generally is giving some, hey, backups failed, backups passed. You should also have someone that if you're getting a continual ticket saying backups failed, it's easy to ignore. We're all inundated with emails, information, alerts that provider calls up and said, hey, this backup's been failing for X amount of days. We should look into it, right? So they should be
Mhm.
doing account reviews and pointing out the things you care about, right? I actually contract with other providers for some that really just to see what the market's doing. And I can get 20, 30 emails a week, and a lot of it's noise, right? But it's great when somebody takes a personal approach and said, hey, this could be an issue. We know that if there were a breach, you have to comply. So that's number one. Number two is logs, right? To be able to and not just we can provide server logging, but we should be able to log what we do inside the system and give you access to that, especially at the point of a breach. I think the third thing that is, well, I mentioned SOC reports and high tech reports. Those are always important because they're cyclical. They're not just a BA that's static. But is incident management, right? I think you've been in this field long enough to know if I promised you something would never happen, I'm fibbing a little bit, and I don't try not to do that. But what do they do in an incident management situation? Hopefully, you don't have to be in that incident to see it. I know Nexus keeps an incident management page you can look at and see how we're handling incidents. We provide, and all providers should, a postmortem if that incident affects you. The other thing I tout a lot is how we handle events across the fleet, right? That may not affect you, but I think it's a great story to tell. You hit on it. It's much easier to what I heard, and if you haven't heard about some, I promise we wouldn't talk about AI, but we already have. So it's much easier, and it's going to get. There is the new Open AI model that's sort of in early preview, and there's a lot of companies trying to make sure it's not used just to. It's great to expose vulnerabilities, but when you expose them to defenders, you expose them to attackers. But a lot of vulnerabilities that sat in a backlog for years by themselves aren't a problem, but when you triangulate them with one or two other vulnerabilities, you use as an attack vector. Those things are easier now. So we're seeing things that kind of sat there, potentially compromised tens of thousands of servers. And so being able to talk about that not as it is a problem, it's a problem we're going to face, right? And incident management, and we're happy to talk about our incident management, how we handled it at the macro and the micro level, because I think for a lot of our clients, it informs how they should do incident management. And I'm pretty sure you have to do that now is provide an incident management plan. And so happy to talk about ours. I can't share all of it because some of it is NDA and protected, but I'm happy to walk through how we handle an incident. And so
Yeah.
to me, those are kind of the three things you should ask a provider about that are tangible: the transparency and the incident management, and whatever I said. The third one was logs, which it goes into transparency. It's all kind of the same thing, but
Yeah.
those are the demonstrables, and like I said, backup restores, so you can actually validate and prove that because an auditor is going to ask for that. I didn't know we're actually. I saw in a recent audit. They'd assembled over 400 pieces of information as artifacts for the audit.
Yeah.
That some of that was even a video. Here's what happens in this situation, or the way someone logs in. That's huge. And I don't think most individual providers have that many things to demonstrate, but that's to the extent an auditor can ask to demonstrate those controls.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're right. We've evolved dramatically. In fact, to the point where we don't say if an incident happens, we say when. And so the
When,
incident response is so important. So it's great that you're working on that as well. Yeah, I'd love to talk about a scenario and kind of get your response. Like imagine a new doctor patient platform is launching and they want to do it quickly in the next 2 to 4
yeah,
weeks or something like that. Maybe the team has limited HIPAA knowledge and but they need a HIPAA compliant, environment quickly.
yeah.
What are the risks of moving that quickly without the right foundation and how does that, security deck compound once workflows are built in and implemented and they're kind of dependent on that when they weren't
Yeah.
architected from the beginning?
Yeah, I'm going to use. I'll get the idioms out of the way, but there's two things we always say. One is building the plane while you're going on the runway or flying already. The other is if not now, when. And I get it, right? When you get tied into something, it's hard to take time to migrate or to change it. But everybody wants now, right? I see a new piece of software we can utilize. I'm like, I want it yesterday, right? And because I have even in my role, tangible business outcomes. If I had this, I could do this, and that's always usually good, right? Or I could avoid this risk. That's the two reasons we do things, right? Benefit or avoidance of risk. And so, doctors, practice managers are no different, right? You also have time to value, right? If I'm going to go pay for this software or development cycles, I want to start recouping that money or that benefit, right? Pass it on. But I think there are a lot of decisions that are pretty hard to unwind. And so we talked about it already. That if I don't, some is really really easy. Like if I add this server and I don't set SSH keys or put it behind my VPN or put it behind a two-factor authentication, some of those aren't that hard to unwind, right? I can go back and add that. There are a few base things that I think the two that I hear a lot, and I think they're either addressable. I think one has always been mandated. I think one is moved from addressable to mandated, but it's encryption, right? We provide, and all providers have different ways of doing this, but we find one of the easiest ways to provide real security, and also it is a checkbox where you just should do it, is encryption at rest. I know you have to do it in transit as well, and that's maybe a little easier. But on servers, I don't care if they're cloud servers, dedicated servers, virtual private cloud, if I don't encrypt that data volume when I create the server, can't go back and do it later. I cannot go back and do it later. And so I have to do for the customer who will help a complicated migration. Typically there's going to be downtime. You're going to have to stop making, updates to the system and do a data freeze. And those are never fun, especially when you become more dependent on that system. So really hard to go back. And sure, could I go in and use software encryption? Yeah, but it's harder, right? Sometimes you want to do both, right? If you're a data table with PHI, you probably want to encrypt that at 2 layers and then in transit. The other is network segmentation. I'm dealing with it right now where you don't start with the end in mind, and it's true, right? A lot of applications when they're in early access and people are learning to use them, maybe it's only if you have multiple offices, maybe one office is the test case, but you start using it. And you say, well, it could be in a flat network. It only needs one server. And then you realize later that it's got a higher database request because you put more load on it. You're using it more. And I need to separate the database. Incredibly common in what we do. But if I don't build a network segmentation plan, it's very hard to make that migration. So to me, though, and we're getting, we actually wanted to get into the weeds a little bit, I think, but those are two things that are expensive decisions to fix down the road. And what I see is deferring it. I can't tell you how often I talk to somebody who said, we've known about this issue for months or years, even scarier. It's just always been too time consuming and too expensive. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like I said, one more idiom. The best time to plant a tree is yesterday. The next best time is today. It's never going to get easier and it's never going to get cheaper, unfortunately, to do it. And cheap, I don't mean just material costs, but in your time.
Yeah, and
Those
to
two
your
things are
point,
huge.
it was encryption in transit before. Now it's encryption at rest. I mean, that keeps and these these policies continue to change. But you're right. I mean, there are things if you make the decision early, you benefit later, which I think is a powerful idea as well.
Yeah, we try, and I always tell my team, who are actually on the front line talking to customers, even more than I am. There are ways to do these that are budget friendly. Like we have to acknowledge that, especially on a new application, everyone has a budget. If you have a handful of users, and so it doesn't have to be. Yeah, I think about physical versus logical, right? We could do things in the physical layer that might be a little more expensive. We could do things in the logical layer. What matters is that you do them and address them and make them as much as possible future proof. Nothing is entirely future proof, but
Yeah.
let's avoid the preventable mistakes, right? Those are hard to change. Yeah.
Makes sense. If a healthcare IT leader is listening to this and and they walked away from this conversation, what three things would you suggest to them that they should verify in their own infrastructure today? What would those three things be? And maybe some things you already mentioned, but if they're like, hey, I want to take action, I want to do something, what three things are on your list that they could work to verify
Hmm.
in their own infrastructure today?
Oh, well, I mean, just and we kind of already hit on one of these, but in general, um, make sure the things that should be working are working, and
Mm.
that they still work, right? If it's a disaster recovery plan that you've tested it, maybe you don't have full site to site disaster recovery, you just want to show that your backups are encrypted. It your provider should, or if it's your internal IT, right? I've heard it is often there, and I've asked people before in all industries, what is your last DR recovery or just a test restore look like? And you can kind of see like deer in the headlights because they know they haven't done it. But that's the first thing I would look at. Now the other is constantly, are we using the right point security solutions? Right. I think those are all. Don't assume, if I think about what we do as Nexcess or what any provider does, the shared responsibility model. We are providing security of and in the data center and of and in the software stack. We are not providing security at the application layer. Now, Nexus in particular, and I think all providers will sell you point solutions, antivirus, malware, EDR, MDR, but constantly verify that those are right and that they're not just, that you have the right granularity set up. I don't want to hear about everything. Like if you go ahead and block, every IP that's known malicious on the internet, but I think that's a constant. That's good. But I want to know that we're escalating the proper things that I need to take a look at that are true, closer to 0 day risks. So that would be the second. And that's maybe the operating system layer. The other, and I know it's really simple, but is lifecycle management.
Mm.
Asset OS lifecycle management, hardware lifecycle management. I can't tell you. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been some pretty ugly vulnerabilities. Now, they're ugly for a machine you can update. I'm thinking particular to like firewall vulnerabilities. But if that machine is so old that it can't take the new update, you have a problem. And you should be, whether it's in your data center, in fact, especially if you have both. That's the other. Rarely am I the only, as Nexus, we the only provider, for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, tons of providers use SaaS because there's things that we don't do, or you want a SaaS. For example, we don't do HIPAA compliant email with encryption. There are providers that are incredibly good at that. But let's make sure that where we're sharing data, that we know that, right? Just a data mapping. I mentioned a data mapping relevant to what we're doing for someone, but you should understand every provider and be able to map them and how they exchange information, if it's an API, if it's a webhook. But you definitely want to audit that and continually understand it, because that's incredibly common too, is that I've secured things at sort of the user level, but not at the API level. So you want to be careful about that. So I don't know if there's 3 or 4 or 5 things, but those are some things I would look at. Are we still? It's pretty common too that do we have the right? Have we gotten old users off the system? You can't tell you, John, how common that is. I talked to a provider or a customer, let's just say, and I say, hey, we called the tech guy, Alan, and they're like, Alan's been gone for like 8 months. And I'm like, well, we didn't disable Alan's VPN user because nobody told us, right? That's you think about shared responsibility. We know the users you give us, and if we're doing account reviews, we'll talk about that. But sometimes people don't show up in those. Life gets busy, but always make sure that you're handling user management. I mean, trusted or untrusted insiders is a huge attack vector, and so the best security stances I've seen have a process, right? And if someone moves on, we have their VPN user 2FA disabled and their account wiped, before they leave the building. And I wish that happened every time because it's just good practice. So
Yeah.
yeah, those are things I would verify. Maybe 7 now, but that's always good.
That's good. Lots of information. As we kind of wrap up, I think it's interesting that, Nexcess works with so many healthcare organizations, telehealth, behavioral health, digital health
Oh
solution
yeah.
providers, right? Medical practices, et cetera. As you talk to them, what is one thing that maybe most organizations wish they had addressed earlier when it comes to compliance infrastructure that maybe they haven't, and maybe that's why they're coming to you. But what are some things you're seeing, that they wish they would have addressed earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but and it's a pain keeping and maintaining that map of where data lives, but also think about where I want to be. I deal with my own provider who I just had to call in to make a payment. And I'm like, you guys don't have a payment portal. Like, we're thinking about adding it. We want to add it, and they're using a portal for scheduling, and payment wasn't there. And I'm not going to go sell IT one on my doctor's appointment. I'm sure there's people that do that, but I always think about the way I use things. And if you think about where we want to be, a roadmap, we talk to our a lot of our customers about what their roadmap is, and so we can help plan for that. And so I think that's it, because by the time it gets down to that funnel and you haven't roadmapped it out, it goes back to the third or fourth question you asked. But if I have that data mapping and I know where I want to go, I don't have to do as much re-architecture or as much running. So I think that's it. And the other probably is just make sure move. Migrating is always hard,
Mhm.
and again, like I said, there's a lot of great providers out there. I think we're great, but there are some that aren't as good. Who it's a checkbox, right? We're gonna to provide a BA and we move on. So I would ask that provider a lot of questions. I don't mind. I have answered hundreds of questions for somebody in the pre decision process, and if someone is frustrated and you're talking to them, I don't care what you're buying. If you're buying software, if you're buying, hiring an MSP to come do stuff in your office, if they really don't want to answer those questions, there's probably something wrong. And so I love to answer those questions, and there's some cool AI tools now to make it easier to answer those questions. Nobody loves RFPs if you're in the by. Nobody loves writing an RFP, and nobody loves answering an RFP. But we're super happy to do it because I wish we were always the second provider. I've been the third or fourth provider where someone is, we moved once and then we realized that the BA wasn't actually good, or they didn't do their last SOC 2. And then I move again, thinking I made the right decision because, again, everyone's going to say we're great. And I don't expect you to trust me either. Ask us those questions, ask for the documentation. So I think that's it. If it's only one migration, that's bad enough, but they're expensive and time consuming. And, really, I see from the initial assessment of a migration through the time you say we're done and we're all migrated over to the infrastructure and I feel comfortable, that's usually 6 months, right? I've seen it done faster. Data moves are easier, but by the time you're from assessment to choose, well, if you're doing that twice in a year, you're really never out of that change cycle. So you can go on and you know really treat the business or the practice like it should be to innovate for customers, right? And add new things. So I wish everyone was with us for 10 years or longer. It's not always the case, but we do pride ourselves on hopefully being the last migration. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a powerful idea. Make sure you're asking the right questions, and you feel free to ask all the questions because you don't want to, like you said, changing is expensive and complex. So
Mm,
you want to make sure
yeah,
you're working with the right partners that can help you ensure your compliance, your security, reliability, uptime. We didn't even get into any of those since we
oh
focus
yeah,
more on compliance today, but I'm sure we'll have you back again in the future to talk more about those things.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
Kelly, thanks so
pleasure
much
again,
for
John, as
sharing your
always.
insights and perspectives. Appreciate you helping us learn more about what healthcare organizations can do to be more compliant and more successful in their hosting environments. And thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcast applications. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, John.